So yeah, I'm going to share my screen and we will get into today's topic. Uh, okay. Okay, so this is not, there we go. Is that showing up? Part four?
Yes, it is.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
So the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Just a recap from the last 2 weeks. So you remember 2 weeks ago, that's where we kind of looked at the historical sources and we found out there were six categories of historical sources that we're using in this study. From that last week, we looked at what are the nine historical facts using a moderate facts approach that we can glean from those sources to help us prove that the resurrection is actually historical. And that leads us into today's class, where we're going to be looking at the third and final level of assessment. Looking at what are some of the explanatory hypotheses that skeptics come up with to explain these nine facts. How do they try to explain it? And for today's class, we're going to be looking at four skeptical hypotheses. And then next week, we're going to finish off with another four skeptical hypotheses, and then finish off with the resurrection, the Christian resurrection hypothesis, and see how they do in terms of explaining these facts. So just before I begin, another bit of advertising. So for, again, my friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, I've told you guys about his 4-volume. This is his magnum opus, right? So he spent about 14 years researching the resurrection for these books. Coincidentally, that was the same year that I met Gary as an unbeliever, and that he started helping me out with the evidence to bring me to faith in Christ. But basically, for today's the next 2 weeks, a lot of the information came from volume 2 in his 4-volume series on refuting the skeptical hypotheses here. So that's another helpful resource. Okay, so looking at the level of the historical hypotheses, it's helpful to have a set of criteria. How do we assess is this a good hypothesis or a bad hypothesis? And on that front, we're going to be employing what are called the best explanation inference criteria. So, in other words, these are four criteria that we can use to assess the different hypotheses and say which of them is the best explanation. So in the first place, we have plausibility. So plausibility, this just says that the hypothesis must be implied by or consistent to a greater degree with our background evidence and evidence that isn't directly related to our investigation. So it's not one of those nine facts that we learned about last week, but it's about background knowledge. So for example, if we're asking about, did God raise Jesus from the dead? Relevant background knowledge would be, well, does God exist or not? Kind of thing. So that's what we mean by plausibility. Explanatory scope. So this is a criterion that looks at the quantity of facts that a hypothesis can cover. Obviously, if one hypothesis can cover all nine of the facts, that's better than a hypothesis that can only explain three of them or five or something like that. Then we have explanatory power, and this is the qualitative criteria. So it asks, okay, not just how many of the facts can you explain, but how well do you explain all those facts? Is there an amount of vagueness, or does it take effort to force it to fit the data? Stuff like that. Is there any ambiguity? So that's what explanatory power is. And then finally, we have the simplicity criterion, or the less ad hoc. And this just says that the hypothesis that employs the least amount of ad hoc components. What does ad hoc mean? It just means for this. So it's referring to non-evidenced assumptions. So the hypothesis that has the least amount of non-evidenced assumptions is going to be better relative to ones that employ a whole bunch of non-evidenced assumptions, right? So just before I begin, in terms of the methodology, does that make sense to everybody in terms of these four criteria and how we're assessing these hypotheses? Any questions at all? No, pretty clear. Okay. Okay, great. So this is how we're going to do it. So with that said, let's get into our first historical hypothesis. And as we learned last week, the very first hypothesis that ever came up was actually back in the early church with the Jews. Remember in the Gospel of Matthew, we had the Jews saying, "Oh, you disciples, you stole the body. That's why the tomb is empty." So this is the original conspiracy hypothesis. I'm calling it fraud one, the fraud one hypothesis, right? So it basically says that essentially the disciples themselves, the 12 disciples, conspired together to steal the body from the tomb. So it explains away the empty tomb. And then from there, they were a bunch of liars. For whatever reason, they conspired and told the lie of Jesus' resurrection. They, hid the body somewhere in the ground or whatever and started going around talking about the resurrection for some nefarious purpose. Maybe they wanted fame, maybe they wanted money, or whatever their intentions were. So that's what the original conspiracy hypothesis is. Now, using our four criteria to assess this, this hypothesis is an utter failure. There's a reason it didn't work back in the Apostle Peter's day, and it doesn't work today. So, in the first place, in terms of plausibility, our background knowledge, well, unfortunately for resurrection skeptics, this theory is entirely implausible in the light of modern psychological data. You know, just picture the disciples. So their master and rabbi gets captured and who they believe is the Messiah, and he gets crucified. This was utterly demoralizing. They would have been in shock. They would have been depressed. They would have been disappointed. This would be their mindset at losing Jesus to crucifixion. And then to posit that within a matter of days, within less than 3 days, all 11 men suddenly said, "Hey, I know, let's engage in this conspiracy. Let's steal his body for something, for some purpose, unknown purpose." That is implausible. It doesn't make sense at all with what we know of human psychology. And at the very least, some or most of these men, they would be just, no, it's over. Look, I'm going back to Galilee. I want to get back to fishing. I want to get back to my life. I wasted the last 3 years. I thought Jesus was special, but he's not. He's dead. So that's just what we know from modern psychology. And it's just implausible that all 11 of these guys, plus others, if you're including the women and, the 500, stuff like that, they would all get together and purposefully lie. Um, and this is what we see in history with other messianic figures, right? But the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 AD, that a bunch of Jews thought that Bar Kokhba was in fact the Messiah. He led a revolt. He got killed, and in the end, all of his followers dispersed. Nobody was claiming he rose from the dead. So that's just common nature. We also said NT writes 7 mutations. Remember, we kind of looked at the Christian belief in the resurrection was dissimilar to the prior Jewish beliefs. For example, they believed in only one resurrection of everybody at the end of the world. They didn't have a belief that, oh, but the Messiah would rise as the first fruits first, stuff like that. So just based on our background knowledge of what the Jews believed about the Messiah, this theory wouldn't make sense. If the disciples stole the body and were just a bunch of liars, they would make up a lie that was more consistent with their prior Jewish beliefs. Okay. Now, in terms of explanatory scope, how many of the 9 facts that we learned about last week does this theory explain? Well, it doesn't explain at all the fact that we can prove the disciples were sincere in their belief and they had transformed lives, right? It doesn't attempt to explain resurrection appearances apart from dismissing them as lies, but that's utterly inconsistent with the fact that we know they were sincere. They were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. furthermore, I'd say it doesn't even attempt to really explain the skeptics like James or Paul later on. How did they get converted? This theory just doesn't tell us. Um, okay, so in terms of explanatory power, I think it lacks explanatory power because basically a group of liars in a conspiracy, there's always a leaker. There's especially when you apply persecution and pressure, there's always going to be one or more that are going to recant and they're going to say, hey, this is too much. This wasn't in the cards for me. Look, we lied about it. The body's over there. I'm going back to Galilee. Please don't hurt me, right? So, but in the case of the 11 disciples, none of them recanted. None of them confessed to having this conspiracy or anything like that. So it just doesn't explain the facts. In fact, in light of the fact that these disciples were placed in a situation where they were persecuted. What about simplicity? Does it employ any non-evidenced assumptions? Well, I would argue the entire hypothesis itself is entirely ad hoc. There is no evidence at all of an inner turmoil, let alone a deceitful tendency among the disciples, where they would get together to engage in this conspiracy. So yeah, I would just say it's totally ad hoc on the face of it. And I just want to play. This is a former atheist detective, J. Warner Wallace, and he came to faith by evaluating the evidence for the resurrection from a professional detective's standpoint. And he totally outrules the conspiracy theory. So let me just play that 5-minute clip for you guys from J. Warner Wallace. And hopefully the video is showing up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that.
But hey, maybe they're just lying about this. Some of you in this room, I know, you like conspiracy theories. Those are stupid, okay? If you think you know of a successful conspiracy, you don't, because it's not successful by definition if you know about it, right? It turns out, if they're lying about this, there are 5 things that are necessary to complete a criminal conspiracy. We know how about this. We have to use these 5 things to break conspiracies. I'm going to teach it to you. These are the 5 things you have to be successful in a conspiracy. 1, you want the smallest number of co-conspirators. Not rocket science, right? 2 people can keep a secret longer and better than 22 people. 2, you want it for the shortest possible amount of time. The best conspiracies are where 2 people commit a crime together, then one kills the other. Awesome conspiracy. Only 2 were involved, and now it's over. 3, you have to have excellent communication between co-conspirators, because we're going to jam you up and start asking questions. We're going to separate you, right? First thing we're going to do is separate you. Why are we doing that? Because we know unless you can communicate, you will not have all the same details perfectly memorized. So you need good communication. I just talked to the detective, and I told him this. So you can repeat it to me. Of course, I'm going to get in the weeds when I do the interview, so there's no way you're going to have covered that stuff in advance. 4, if you've got a close familial relationship with somebody, there's a better chance you're going to protect that person than if you don't. And 5, if you can avoid pressure, this can go on forever. If no one's asking questions, no one's going to catch it. These are the 5 things that are needed to successfully complete a conspiracy. If you're telling me that the Christian disciples were lying about the resurrection, then they have to have these 5 things. And if you ask me, already it's too big a group. It's not just James and Peter and John. It's not just the 12. How many do we have in the upper room? They're picking a replacement for Judas. And from people who had seen the Christ, seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And what does Paul tell us? And the oldest creed in all of Christendom is in 1 Corinthians 15:3. Right? For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scripture, that he was buried and raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. 500? That's right. So how big is this group? Too big. That's the problem. Let's play a game of Clue together. Okay, old school Clue. This is the old school Clue board. So our game is going to be a little bit different. We'll take the area around where Jesus did his ministry. Our game pieces will be the disciples. The first part of this game is how long do these... There's already too many, by the way. This group is already too large. It's not 12. It's over 500 people. It's too large. I'm already out. But if they only have to hold it for a minute, they could probably do it. But it's not a minute or 6 minutes or 6 hours or 6 days or 6 months or 6 years it's 6 decades. You want me to believe that this group of over 500 people kept this without anyone ever breaking or recanting for 60 years? No, that to me doesn't seem reasonable. It's possible. And by the way, the next thing is going to be communication. Are they able to talk to it and like line up their stories? Okay, they're not in this holy huddle. They're all over the game board. So this dude over here, Thomas, has no way to communicate with Matthew. And by the way, as they're snapping fingers off of Thomas, they're telling him already, hey, Matthew's already told us the whole story. Confess to it. Confess to it. He's not confessing to it. He's not changing his story. Hey, Paul's already drinking margaritas over here, okay? Come on, tell us the truth. He's not changing his story. And no way to communicate. They can't Snapchat each other. They can't text each other. How do they tell in real time what the other person is saying? That's a problem. They're separated by too many miles. Now, are they undergoing any pressure? Have you ever watched Jack Bauer in the original 24? Okay, that dude, if he was doing an interview and he needed to get to the truth, what would he do? Whatever it takes to get to the truth. No rules. That's what's happening to these guys. They're being tortured for their testimony. Just get one to recant. It's game over. No one's budging for their testimony. Of course, the next question is, are there any brothers? Yeah, there are brothers. You got, Peter and Andrew. You got James and John. But over here, you got a guy who is not even related to the ministry of John the Baptist. You got a guy who was not part of that in crowd. That group of people who was hanging out with John the Baptist, who were looking and waiting for the Messiah. So when John saw him, he could say, hey, there's the Messiah. There's the Lamb of God. And they all go over and become Jesus' disciples. This dude is not one of them. This dude is somebody nobody likes. He's the one non-disciple outside watching all of it named Levi, who comes into the group late with no friendship to anybody in the group. They didn't want to be at his house that night for dinner. Yet after watching this nonsense for 3 years, he is now in the group. And he writes one of the earliest Gospels and never flinches. That's interesting to me.
And so I think you guys get the point there. So that's how a professional detective. But with 4 out of the 5 features, they utterly fail. So this means it lacks explanatory power. The original conspiracy hypothesis is an utter failure because the circumstances don't fit the environment for a successful conspiracy. So does that make sense to everybody on the first hypothesis, or any questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. All right. So I think everybody gets that. So let's go to the next hypothesis. And this one is kind of related, right? So I call it the alternate conspiracy, or the fraud 2 hypothesis. Now, this one, rather than saying that Jesus' own disciples conspired and lied about the resurrection and conspired to steal the body, it says one of two things. Either somebody else stole the body from the tomb, and then disciples encountered the empty tomb and they deluded themselves into believing Jesus rose from the dead, or there's an alternative here known as the wrong tomb hypothesis. So I'm including both these versions as the fraud 2 hypothesis. So the wrong tomb hypothesis says, once again, the women forgot where Joseph laid his body, and they went to the wrong tomb. And from there, they saw the empty tomb, and the disciples deluded themselves. Oh, Jesus must have rose from the dead. Now, interestingly, with the wrong tomb hypothesis, there is actually some claimed evidence supporting this that you guys might not be aware of from archaeology. So this comes from a resurrection skeptical scholar called Dr. James Tabor. And there's a discovery called the Telpiot tomb. Out of curiosity, is anyone here familiar with the Telpiot tomb at all? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
I have not.
No? Okay, so in that case, I'll play. This is kind of it's a 6-minute clip, but I think it'll, even though it's a lengthy one, it'll be helpful to give you guys the background. But this is supposedly, according to James Tabor, the actual tomb site of Jesus's family. And it's claimed that we have Jesus's actual bones still here along with his family. So let me just play that 6-minute clip to give you guys the background. This is what the skeptics are claiming. Okay. Um, so Lost Tomb. Here we go.
Israel. An ancient land of endless ruins which all have stories to tell. Of the many treasures to be found among Israel's rich historical remains is a tomb that was unearthed in 1980 in Talpiot, east of Jerusalem. Inside, an ossuary was uncovered which read, "Jesus, son of Joseph." Yet the tomb was considered an insignificant find for 27 years, until the emergence of a film that put forth an exciting yet controversial theory. Because the tomb contained ossuaries that bore inscriptions closely resembling the Holy Family of the New Testament.
In a technical session, you actually get to do what you were learning in the classroom. Sample plankton and seaweed, it's all.
This new film suggests that the Talpiot tomb is the lost tomb of Jesus. From approximately 20 BCE until the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Jewish people observed a unique religious burial practice that was connected to their belief in physical resurrection. When a family member died, the body of the deceased was left in the family tomb to decay for a minimum of 1 year. A year later, when the flesh of the deceased had fully decayed, the family would return to the tomb to gather the bones of their loved one. Yet another day of mourning would occur as the bones were placed in a stone box called an ossuary. Sometimes the name of the individual was carved on the side of the ossuary for identification purposes. The lid was firmly placed on the ossuary, and it was stored away in the tomb to await a complete resurrection.
There's a tremendous amount of expansion around Jerusalem. They were constantly coming into archaeological remains. The most significant remains were normally tombs.
It all starts on the Thursday, the 27th of April, 1980. They're building this new neighborhood. It's connecting on to an original part of the neighborhood which had been built 5 or 6 years beforehand.
Dr. Shimon Gibson, one of Israel's leading archaeologists, was one of the few people to enter the Talpiot tomb after its discovery. His job was to survey and record the dimensions of the Talpiot tomb.
It was a Saturday evening. I get a call from Dr. Amos Kloner. He was a district archaeologist at the time for the Jerusalem region. And he said, "Hey, Shimon, a tomb has been discovered. It's being excavated by Yoske Gat. Go out and help record this interesting tomb." I participated in the excavation. We recorded the tomb. There were workers there who were clearing out the soil within a cave, which indicated to me straight away that this cave had been opened in antiquity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have an accumulation of soil within the cave itself. It was quite shallow in the kochim, in these loculi, which extended off like tunnels in different directions from the main chamber walls. There, one could have seen those ossuaries on the day of the discovery, and hence they were taken out first. The first thing they did was to dig out these ossuaries, bag them, put them into boxes, and then to convey them to the Rockefeller Museum.
At the time of its discovery, the Talpiot tomb was considered to be just one more of the many tombs that have been unearthed in the Jerusalem area. There seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary about it. According to archaeologists, it was not a significant tomb at all. However, 27 years after its discovery, the Talpiot tomb finally gained public attention with the release of the film The Lost Tomb of Jesus. this film claimed to have found proof that this is the tomb and final resting place of the body of Jesus Christ and his family. What are the claims that were made in order to prove this controversial theory? Claim number 1. Inscriptions found in the Talpiot tomb seem to match the names we might expect to find in a tomb belonging to Jesus and his family. The most interesting of the names being Jesus, son of Joseph. Claim number 2. Mary Magdalene and Jesus may have been married with a son, which explains why her ossuary might be in the tomb along with an ossuary reading, Judah, son of Jesus. The Lost Tomb of Jesus film claims that DNA testing could support this. Claim number 3. The gable on the Talpiot tomb could be an early Christian symbol linked to the tomb of the Apostle Peter. Claim number 4. The infamous James ossuary may in fact be the missing ossuary from the Talpiot tomb. Because James was the brother of Jesus, they claim this further proves that the Talpiot tomb contains the Holy Family.
Okay, so that's what the skeptics are claiming here. So, yes, I don't know if you guys said you've never heard of this, but obviously this sent shockwaves when it came out around Easter time as a documentary called The Lost Tomb, and it was actually made by James Cameron. Now, should we be worried as Christian apologists? Is this game over? Have they actually found Jesus' bones, proving that, well, I guess the women went to the wrong tomb and Jesus never rose from the dead? Absolutely not. So remember, Dr. Shimon Gibson, I don't know if you remember his name, but I used him when I was talking about the site of Golgotha. And remember, he was saying there that actually, no, we have Jesus's empty tomb at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So right there, there's a contradiction with the Talpiot tomb. But here's how we assess this hypothesis. So in terms of the plausibility, so it must be admitted, in terms of somebody else stealing the body, we do have archaeological evidence from the Nazareth decree, or the inscription we learned about in week 2, that suggests, yeah, there are times when people rob graves. Grave robbing was something that happened in ancient Judea and stuff like that. And there are various alternatives. One might say, maybe someone is robbing the tomb. Well, that doesn't seem plausible with Jesus. He wasn't buried with any rich jewelry or anything like that someone would want to rob. But someone might try to argue maybe a necromancer or something like that. But I think one of the problems here is that makes it implausible is the timing. So if somebody else did steal the body, why would it be the case that they just happened to steal the body on the third day, right when Jesus predicted he would rise from the dead? There seems to be that's a huge coincidence that some necromancer or somebody would just randomly steal the body the same day Jesus predicted he would rise. So I think that's an implausibility there. In terms of the women going to the wrong tomb, I think that is also equally implausible. I mean, imagine all the women just simultaneously forgetting where the tomb was. And I mean, sure, what about Joseph of Arimathea? He wouldn't have forgotten where his own tomb was. So once resurrection claims started going around, wouldn't he have went, well, what are you talking about? I went to the tomb and the body's still there. That he didn't rise from the dead. So that's the wrong tomb theory is totally implausible on that front. And as we're going to see, there's major problems with the Talpiot tomb as evidence. Now, in terms of explanatory scope, it's clear that this hypothesis only works for explaining the empty tomb at best, right? That's all it attempts to explain. And then it pretends like the disciples were deluded afterwards. Oh, they deluded themselves into believing Jesus rose from the dead. But that would make them go against all of their prior theological Jewish beliefs. And delusion is usually accompanied by a strong mental deficiency or problem. We have no evidence that the disciples suffered mentally or had, let alone all of them, had some kind of cognitive deficiency where they would be prone to delusions of this sort. Let alone this theory can't explain how skeptics like James or the Apostle Paul, why did they claim to have appearances? How do you explain them? They wouldn't have been deluded even if there was an empty tomb. And okay, here's the Telpiot tomb again. Now, in terms of explanatory power, I would say that the wrong tomb theory or stolen by somebody else, these theories both lack explanatory power, again, on a psychological and historical basis. And N.T. Wright has written, again, remember those 7 mutations where they totally transformed their belief in the resurrection from the prior Jewish belief into the Christian ones, right? Where, okay, now we worship on Sunday, not Saturday. We have different practices. We no longer circumcise people and stuff like that. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. All these changes, that's just not socioculturally expected. Delusion wouldn't cover that type thing. Also, in terms of the Telpiot tomb itself, so I want to give some sound critiques to this, because this seems to be archaeological proof supporting the wrong tomb theory, but virtually all the scholars universally reject this thesis. And that includes all the scholars that were interviewed for James Cameron's documentary. Basically, he lied to them. He didn't tell them what he was going to be using what they were saying, and he took them out of context. And they actually got together and did a legal thing to sue James Cameron and the director to correct the record. And so I just want to play some of the scholars that were interviewed in this documentary about the Telpiot tomb and why they universally reject it. So let me just play a couple of video clips on that. Okay, so 1958.
Just before you move on, Dale, isn't there Jesus' family wasn't rich, so they wouldn't all be in the tomb, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there are various problems. So maybe I should just say what some of these problems are in the first place, right? So this is from Dr. Gary Habermas's website, and he lists 12 major problems with the Telpiot tomb. So the first is that the Telpiot tomb is a wealthy tomb, and you could say, well, Joseph of Arimathea's buried Jesus and he was wealthy, but the Telpiot tomb claims that this was Jesus's family tomb. It doesn't talk about Joseph of Arimathea. The skeptics are saying, no, this is where Jesus' entire family was buried. It was his family tomb. But that doesn't make sense. Jesus is from Nazareth, up in Galilee. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. So that's one of the objections why scholars reject this claim. Among other things, the DNA evidence establishes no positive links in this tomb whatsoever. And in fact, one of the generations is mixed up. It looks like the person they're calling Mary Magdalene wasn't related to Jesus' wife. It almost looks like she was his daughter, or lower down in the genetic profile. Also, the names are incredibly common. So they pretend like, well, because there's a Mary, there's a Joseph, there's a James, and there's a Jesus, son of Joseph, that, well, this is remarkable. It could only have belonged to Jesus Christ. But these names are remarkably common, and they're found in all archaeological digs of first century tombs and that. So yeah, I just wanted to, you can see here's the genetic things where the film contradicts the actual data and that sort of thing. But let me just show the clips of the scholars and why they reject this claim of the Telpiot tomb.
However, a majority of scholars are of a different opinion.
The uniqueness of Yosei, the uniqueness of Maria, is actually not unique at all. We find these all over the place, both in Greek and Hebrew, in the ossuaries that we have in and around Jerusalem.
Now, these names are in fact common. I know of at least 24 examples of Yosei. So that's not a rare form of the name.
In fact, looking at the IAA catalog alone, we find variations of the name Joseph, including the nickname Yosei, 19 times. It is one of the most common names found on ossuaries from this period.
Drinking warm water before bed helps flush fat out of the body while you sleep. Apparently thousands
Yosei on its own does not appear to be enough solid evidence linking the Talpiot tomb to Jesus of Nazareth. But what about the combination of names? The lost tomb of Jesus theory claims that when applying statistics to this group of names, the probability that this is not the tomb of the Jesus of the Bible is 1 in 600.
The so-called odds of 600 to 1 in favor of identifying the East Talpiot tomb as the tomb of Jesus' family don't impress me, because the calculations are based on a series of erroneous identifications. And so I claim no expertise in statistics whatsoever. But in my view, statistics have no validity if they're based on mistakes.
Okay, so that's it. As you can see, and these were the same scholars that were interviewed in that documentary. They were so outraged that they were taken out of context. They made this their own documentary refuting the claims. So the Talpiot tomb is proof of nothing. It has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. It's not Jesus's tomb. So does that make sense to everybody? Any questions at all, or? No. Okay. All right. Fair enough. I know that's something new for you guys, but yeah. The Talpiot tomb was one of those fads, and it's gone now. Nobody takes it seriously. Okay, so we have our third hypothesis then, the Swoon Hypothesis. So this is a resurrection skeptics, Muslims in particular, go for this theory. And this theory says, well, look, Jesus never died in the first place. He just swooned on the cross. So he fainted. In other words, he got close to death, but he didn't actually die. And the Romans and everybody else thought he was dead. So they put him in a tomb. And apparently over the course of 3 days, he completely healed and revived. And so he went to the disciples and he said, hey guys, here I am. And the disciples, oh my gosh, 3 days later, you rose from the dead. That you must have, they deluded themselves into believing that he was risen from the dead. So that's the swoon theory. And again, that's a popular theory by a lot of Muslims, such as Ahmadiyya Muslims, and I think Sufi Muslims as well. So what are some of the problems? Well, in terms of the plausibility, our background evidence shows this to be highly implausible based on modern medical knowledge. So our modern medical knowledge basically shows us the immense dangers of crucifixion. Even for a short period of time, it inevitably leads to tremendously life-threatening damage through various means, ranging. So back in the 1930s, I believe, a scientist, Pierre Barbet, medical doctor, actually did experiments with real living people as well as corpses, and he crucified them. Now, obviously, he didn't put nails through the living people, right? He tied them up, but he put them in the crucifixion position. And it was very clear within a very short period of time, people would start to asphyxiate, right? You can't breathe because your lungs are pressed, and it prevents you from breathing. So, some medical doctors are saying, well, that's what kills you on the cross. You run out of breath. You run out of strength. So you can't lift up to breathe. Like you have to press up on your legs in order to go and breathe in. But eventually you lose strength and you can't push up and you can't breathe in anymore. And that's what kills you. But in addition to that, there are other things. There are other hypovolemic shock will kick in. And that was the case with Jesus. We know he was in hypovolemic shock because of the scourging he went. Remember, he says, I thirst and stuff like that. So that's another fatal condition, and other things. So here's a medical journal by Dr. Gary Habermas called Medical Views on the Death by Crucifixion of Jesus Christ. This is a secular medical journal. And here is the list of all the things that happen to you when you're crucified. These are how you end up getting killed. And you can see all of these secular medical experts and forensic pathologists here supporting that you would die. How, out of all these experts, how many support the no death or the swoon theory? We've got a total of 3 doctors supporting this, and that's it. So yeah, I don't think the swoon theory really holds up to scrutiny just based on our medical knowledge alone. And this is backed up by our historical knowledge, because out of everyone that was crucified, we only know of one single person who survived, because he was he was put up on the cross with 2 other friends. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us about this. And they were taken down right away, like less than half an hour, and they were given the best medical care the ancient world had to offer. The Roman emperor's doctors were looking after these guys because they were Josephus's friends. The 2 still died, and the other one just barely managed to survive. We only have one known example in history of someone surviving crucifixion. And the circumstances were totally different to Jesus. This person was taken down right away and given the best medical care the world had to offer at that time. Jesus wasn't given any of that. He was put in a tomb and with scourge wounds, a crown of thorns, a brutal chest wound, which would have been impossible to survive when you see the blood and water come out, the clear liquid. So yeah, it is medically speaking impossible that Jesus could have survived the cross. So on that front, it's implausible. Also, this theory lacks explanatory scope because it can't explain the conversion of skeptics like James and Paul. Maybe somehow the disciples were so deluded when they saw Jesus come out of the tomb, they became convinced he rose from the dead. But skeptics like James and Paul wouldn't fall for something like that, especially Paul, who was hostile. Then, in terms of explanatory power, I think it fails here. Because as I already told you guys, 99% of the people crucified all died in horrible pain. Likewise, why would Jesus, having returned to his disciples, allow them to falsely think he rose from the dead? Don't you think as soon as he's risen, you've been raised from the dead, wouldn't Jesus correct them and say, "Oh no, guys, I need a doctor. I just managed to survive somehow. Please, get the doctor for me," or something like that. Jesus valued truth. He wasn't a liar, and he taught his followers to value truth as well. So that just doesn't have a good explanatory power. And here, by far, is the most important objection in terms of explanatory power, because let's pretend somehow Jesus did manage to survive despite all of his wounds, despite all of our modern medical knowledge saying that would be impossible. Let's pretend to help the skeptics out. Okay, and then Jesus knocks on the door the 3rd day and the disciples come to see him. Do you really believe the disciples would delude themselves into believing you must have risen from the dead? No, he would still have his wounds. He would be hunched over. They would say, like, "My gosh, we need to get someone, call the doctor. He needs help. We need to help him with his wounds," and stuff like that. And this was an objection. This was the counter. All the way back in the 1800s, a skeptic named D.F. Strauss raised this as the knockdown punch for this swoon hypothesis. And I just want to show a clip of Dr. Gary Habermas talking about that in a 2-minute clip and reinforcing that.
What's the basis for them saying?
Okay, here it is.
Regarding the question of the so-called swoon or apparent death theory, I can tell you that a lot of physicians have addressed this question in recent decades, and generally, not always, the most common answer we hear is that death by crucifixion is essentially death by asphyxiation. And the importance of that is this: the Roman historian does not have to be a medical doctor. He does not have to plug the EEG into a rock or the EKG. I mean, all you got to do is hang a person up there and they're going to die. That's the nature of crucifixion. Secondly, we read and that there's coup de grace. There's things you do, breaking the ankle, for example, crucifragium. they break ankles to make sure the person's dead. That's just not enough to be asphyxiated and hang in the low position on the cross, which you can't fake. It's like holding your breath underwater for an hour. It doesn't work. But they didn't break Jesus' ankles. But we read that he's stabbed in the chest with a spear, and the major medical opinion, the most common medical opinions, they were stabbed through the pericardium into the heart. In the Journal of the American Medical Association article of about 20 years ago, they said he was dead when the spear entered his chest, but if he wasn't, the spear wound definitely would have killed him. So I think we have some medical reasons here, including the phenomenon known as sucking chest. If they'd missed and they hit him through here, he would sound to if he hit him in the pleural cavity, he would sound to a soldier as if he were still breathing. I think they'd probably have to do it again.
Watch this before drinking plant-based milks.
Oat milk latte.
Protein and oats X, almost exact.
Okay, so that's it for that. All right. And also in terms of simplicity or the less ad hoc, now this, we have to remember in context, the ancient Roman centurions guarding the crucifix, they would face the death penalty. If they didn't do their job, and they allowed a criminal to live that had been crucified, they themselves would have been crucified as a punishment. So it was their job. They did this day in, day out, ensuring that the bodies on the cross were dead. They knew how to spot a dead body versus someone that was simply swooning or alive. So it is incredibly ad hoc to assume that all the Romans present, just let alone all the other witnesses, had a bad day and somehow Jesus got through alive and they thought he was dead. And another ad hoc component here is that they must assume, without any evidence, that the women and the beloved disciple, John, who were present at the cross, as well as Joseph of Arimathea, all were oblivious to Jesus being alive as they transported his body from the cross to the tomb and that sort of thing. And they just didn't happen to notice that he was still alive or breathing or something like that. That's incredibly ad hoc, in my opinion. So, yeah, that's it for the swoon theory. Any questions on that one or? No. Okay. All right. I think that one's familiar. I know Sully said he talked about the swoon theory with you guys. So, okay. So our last fourth hypothesis for today is the legend hypothesis, right? So, C.S. Lewis was famous for kind of making his trilemma, right? Either Jesus was a liar, either the disciples were liars, or they were lunatics, they were nuts, or Jesus really rose from the dead. He was the Lord. And this is known as his liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. And resurrection skeptics today, such as Dr. Richard Carrier, are quick to point out, well, this is a false trilemma because there's actually a fourth option or alternative here, the legend hypothesis. In other words, we just dismiss the facts related to Jesus' death and resurrection as legends. And there are different versions of the legend hypothesis, right? Some people are more nuanced than others. But for this one, I wanted to go with the most radical legend hypothesis. This is someone like Dr. Richard Carrier here, who is a Jesus mythicist. And they say that, yeah, the stories surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection, they're just entirely made up. They're just myths invented by copying what's known as the pagan dying and rising gods myth. So that's the legend hypothesis that we're evaluating here. So what are some of the problems with that? Well, is this a plausible theory? In the first place, I would say no, it is highly implausible because virtually all secular historians and scholars know that there simply are no examples of dying and rising pagan gods that existed prior to and even immediately after Jesus' death. There are no pagan dying and rising gods for the disciples to copy. So this is just a fact they get wrong. Also, it would, even if there were such examples, it's highly implausible that a bunch of rustic Galilean Jews, right? So these aren't even city folk, the liberal city folk of Jerusalem who are open and stuff to Hellenism, These guys were from Galilee, Capernaum and stuff. They were fishermen. They were handymen and stuff like that. These guys are not receptive at all to pagan myths. You think they would make up a story of a resurrected Messiah based on a pagan story of a dying and rising God? That's totally implausible. They would never betray their Judaism that they had grown up with, and go for a pagan myth or something like that. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense. And actually, yeah, just here's a 3-minute clip of Dr. William Lane Craig talking about how there's no examples of this. Okay. No, well, swoon theory, why is that? Okay, here we go.
Could you respond to the assertion of other pagan resurrection myths that are said to predate and influence the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah. Remember I mentioned that New Testament scholarship has tried all these other things before. And one of them back in the late 19th century, early 20th century was this attempt to compare Christian beliefs to what one could find in other ancient religions. And one of the things that was tried was to look at supposed resurrection myths of dying and rising gods, like Osiris and Tammuz and Adonis and so forth. And some of the scholars at that time thought to try to explain away the Christian belief in the resurrection as a result of the influence of these pagan myths of dying and rising gods. Well, that movement soon collapsed within New Testament scholarship. And these internet people who are still pushing it are over 100 years out of touch with scholarship on this issue. Why did it collapse? For two reasons. Number one, the parallels turned out to be spurious. In fact, there are no parallels in ancient mythology of dying and rising deities. For example, Osiris, one of the most popular of these myths, doesn't really come back to life at all. He just continues to live in the nether realm of the dead, in the underground realm of the departed dead. He doesn't come back to life in this world. And a Swedish scholar named Trygg Mettinger recently did a study of these dying and rising gods. And he says that among scholars who still think that there might be dying and rising gods in the ancient world, these are regarded as dinosaurs in scholarship today. And he tries to salvage just a couple that look like they could be dying and rising gods, but even he admits they don't have any parallels to the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus is a Jewish idea that is without parallel in other ancient religions. The second reason that this movement collapsed was, in any case, there's no causal connection between these pagan myths and the first disciples of Jesus. I mentioned before that what has happened in New Testament scholarship in the latter half of the 20th century has been the eclipse of mythology as a relevant category for the historical Jesus and the rediscovery of the Jewishness of Jesus. And it was realized that it was simply the wrong interpretive background to try to understand Jesus of Nazareth and the Gospels against the backdrop of these Greco-Roman and other sorts of pagan myths of dying and rising deities. So that there just isn't a causal connection. Jews were aware of these pagan religions and they found them abhorrent. And so there are no cults of these seasonal dying and rising gods in first century Israel. No trace at all. So the idea that the disciples would sincerely come to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was actually risen physically from the dead on the basis of these myths is just utterly implausible. And so for that reason, this is a movement that has been tried and found wanting in New Testament scholarship and doesn't command significant scholarly following today.
Yeah, I think he pretty much said it as best as I could there. It's utterly implausible to pretend that the story of Jesus' resurrection was just a copy of some pagan and dying and rising God myth. where a bunch of Jews came together and made that up and stuff like that. And in the first place, as I said, dating to the time of Jesus and the immediate aftermath, there are no actual examples of dying and rising gods. The only examples from antiquity date at least 100 or 200 years after Jesus. So if anything, they're copying the Christians, you could say. And yep, here's just some of the examples they give. They say Romulus. You saw William and Craig talked about Osiris. He's never rose from the dead at all. He's still in the land of the dead, ruling the land of the dead. He never rose from the dead. Finally, in terms of the legend hypothesis, I think it lacks explanatory scope because pagan legends would not convert the zealous Pharisee, an academically trained Saul of Tarsus, or the Apostle Paul. He wouldn't have fallen for these pagan influences or these dying and rising God things, even if they were around. In terms of explanatory power, this theory utterly fails in this regard, since it can't adequately explain all the relevant historical facts that we established in terms of last week's. The appearance to the 500, how would you explain that? The appearance to the women, even the appearance to the skeptical James as well, because again, we have this information that he was skeptical. But if you're saying the disciples just got together and invented Jesus as a mythical being, well, then why do we have James, who's said to be his brother in the first place? There's just so a myth has a real world brother? That doesn't make any sense. In terms of the simplicity, lastly, this theory is entirely ad hoc. It has various non-evidenced assumptions that it employs. And in fact, the assumptions it makes even contradict the actual provable evidence. Remember, last week when we outlined those 9 historical facts, these weren't just a list of facts that we're calling facts. We proved that using the criteria of authenticity. If you're a historian, you have to accept these facts because they're evidenced by the criteria. It's not just speculation like what these resurrection skeptics are doing. And then you also have to explain the totally different origin of the changes in Christian belief and their practices. Why all of a sudden would they change from Saturday to Sunday worship and get rid of circumcision and all those 7 mutations that N.T. Wright talks about? The myth hypothesis or legend hypothesis doesn't explain that in any way. So that's it for this week. Let me get from you guys any questions at all or anything like that in terms of what we covered today.
The thing that pointed out to me about in the myth thing was that myths were abhorrent to, hope I said that right, to the Jews.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, paganism was utterly abhorrent, especially in this period, right? Where, just a couple hundred years earlier, they had the celebration of Hanukkah because Greek pagan rulers, were forcing paganism and pagan beliefs onto the Jews, and they fought a war and killed the pagan overlords and won their independence. So it was incredibly important to them to hang on to monotheism and not engage in paganism or even do anything that would be supportive of pagan beliefs. So yeah, the idea of them in the first century, Peter standing around and saying, I'm going to make up a guy named Jesus and he's going to be the Messiah. And yeah, let's say he died and rose from the dead, like a pagan myth. No, that's abhorrent. It would never happen. Any other questions or comments? Okay. How is the Telpiot tomb? Because I'm just kind of curious if I confused you guys on that at all, or did you guys understand the counters to that one? Okay, fair enough.
I never heard of it before.
Yeah.
It's the first time I'm hearing about that anyway.
Believe it or not, it is outdated. I think it was popular back around the 2008, 2005 to 2010 is when the documentary came out. And once the scholars all kind of universally rejected it, because the fact that there's a tomb with ossuaries or bone boxes that have Jesus, that's a common name. Jesus' name is Joshua, right? Yeshua in Jew, and Mary, and Joseph. Okay, well that doesn't prove that it's Jesus of the Gospels in any way. Those names are incredibly common, and we have dozens of archaeological findings with those names in them. It doesn't prove anything. They're making so much out of, well, look, we found these names. Isn't that remarkable? But it could be any family, really.
One chap said it's a 1 out of 16, 600 chance. The last one. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, that's what the resurrection skeptics are saying. They're saying there's a 600 to 1 odds of finding those unique names in that tomb. But number one, it's just total nonsense. They're not unique names at all. And secondly, statisticians actually studied the mathematics that they did, and that was totally fraudulent. So that even the math was incorrect. The odds can't be relied on at all. So, and that's in the documentary that, if it's still up, or did I get rid of it? So lost. So if you guys are interested in like the full rebuttal of that, I'll just share my screen again quickly. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah.
So the title of the video.
Not up yet.
It's not up?
It's a blank screen.
Oh,
okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the title of the video, it's called Lost Tomb of Jesus Scam.
Okay.
Unearth the Telpiot Tomb. And this was a documentary put together by the scholars who were interviewed in the original documentary, but they didn't like that they were taken out of context because they don't support the Telpiot Tomb. And basically, James Cameron and the director were lying. They were trying to make it seem to people who don't know about it that all the scholars believe this was Jesus's tomb, when actually 99% of the scholars don't. There's only one scholar in the entire world who thinks this is Jesus' tomb, and his name's James Tabor. I don't know where he is, but yeah, it's not. So this was done by the scholars, totally refuting all of their claims. So check that out.
Some of them did not believe in the resurrection, scholars, and it surprises me that they said they refused to believe that Jesus had risen. And they said the body that is in the grave will live on and on. So I believe they think that there would be no resurrection for that body that lives on.
Gotcha. So you're saying, like, in general, most scholars disagree with the resurrection, or you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah. I think it's hard. I guess I think that would be correct, because most scholars aren't necessarily Christians, right? So they wouldn't believe in miracles or anything like that.
Yes. Right. That's what I meant.
Yeah. Now, there is one thing I will say with the Society of Biblical Literature, which is a major fellowship of all the biblical scholars in the world and stuff like that. And I do think the majority of that group do believe in the resurrection based on the evidence. But yeah, there's about 5,000 scholars or something like that in that group.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
Yep. All right. And is that it? Any questions or comments, or you guys are good? Okay. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. I hope you guys learned at least one thing, as Suli was telling you. And next week, we're going to continue on. It's going to be the same thing as this week. We're going to look at 4 skeptical hypotheses. So the illusion hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and then I've got a couple things that are non-standard. One of them is going to be on rainbow bodies, which I think will be a bit different. It's a Buddhist. Basically Buddhists say Jesus didn't rise from the dead. He got what's called a rainbow body, and that's your hypothesis.
I want to hear that. Rainbow body, what that looks like.
Basically, it's like they think the body after death becomes literal rainbow light. So it shrinks away and becomes rainbow light as you become enlightened or whatever. So we'll learn about that next week. But all right, guys. Well, have a great week, everybody, and I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.